following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
Thank you, Tally Olson. I am back, and you are comfortably zoned with me, the Zig Zag Man. I'm in Alameda, California, right across the bay from San Francisco, across the moat from Oakland, northern part of the great state of California. Happy to be here. As I promise my listening audience on a regular basis, I simply talk to the most interesting folks on the planet. And today is no exception. He's an author, he's a Renaissance man, and he's a survivor. His name is Lee Kluck. How are you, Lee?
Wonderful, Ralph. How are you? It's good to be here with you. I wished I was across the bay from Oakland right now. I'm sitting in the middle of Wisconsin, and it's the weather is cheery. Otherwise, I'm doing all right.
Well, you know what you have that I don't have? You have the memories of the Milwaukee Braves when I was growing up.
That is true.
One of my Giants left New York in '57, and in the World Series, I rooted so hard for that Braves team. I was just a kid. I was heartbroken. I really tried to root for them the next year. In '58, it was one of my favorite all-time teams, and I always marvel at how an organization could get a Warren Spahn, a Hank Aaron, an Eddie Matthews, a Red Schoendienst, all on the same roster at one time, and they were so deep, and we're not even talking about Logan and Torrey.
And Lou Burdette and Bob Buell, and the list goes on and on and on, and
on and on. McMahon was a terrific relief pitcher. Del Crandall was the best catcher in the National League at the time.
Big Gene Conley.
Who was a Boston Celtic as well. He almost went to Israel with Pumpsy Green, but that's another story. Let's talk about the book you are writing. Tell me about it. It's Harry Dalton, the Dalton Gang.
Yep. I'm writing a book called the tentative title of the book, and it's well underway in production, and I've signed a contract with the University of Nebraska Press to publish it, and I'm thrilled to be under their wing. The name of the book is called Leave While the Party's Good: The Life, Times, and Legacy of Harry Dalton.
A very unheralded man, given his accomplishments in baseball. Can you
absolutely
talk about the Dalton Gang and how he reached his prominence?
Yep. Well, Harry, as you said, I feel is very unheralded considering what he did and the impact that he had on the game at various points in his career. He began working for the Baltimore Orioles in 1954. His parents had moved from Springfield, Massachusetts to Baltimore, and when Harry got out of the Air Force and back from Korea, he got a job on he answered an ad in the paper and sent a letter in to someone that had said, hey, we'd really like, if you want to go about this, send in a letter. And he ended up interviewing with Jim McLaughlin, who was what they called the farm director at that time. It was sort of the head of scouting and the head of the minor league system for the Orioles, and he had come over from St. Louis. In a little over 5 years, Harry went from the assistant to the head of the farm department, and then in 5 more years, in the winter of '65, he became, in essence, the general manager of the Baltimore Orioles at 35. And this coincided with an influx of talent that his farm system had brought in, and they became, thanks to that influx of talent and a timely trade by Lee McPhail, who left to go work for MLB, and they won the World Series in 1966, Harry's first year. And people started to take notice that Harry was a very cerebral. Yep. Well, actually, Earl didn't get a job until 1968.
No,
Hank Bauer was the manager of the first year.
Hank Bauer was the manager, yes.
Yep.
Hank
Bauer was, yep, and former Marine and former Yankee, and so they won a title in '66. And people started to take notice. Harry was the sort of the darling of baseball. He was probably at one point the most well-known GM in the game. But the other thing was he was real cerebral, so he would look at the world of baseball. And that's one thing, it's one thing to study the teams that he was the general manager of. He would go on to win pennants in 69, 70, and 71. And, of course, they won the World Series in 70 and got beat by the Miracle Mets of your – I'm sure they have a sainted place in your heart. And
yes, they do.
Also,
yes, they do.
Yep, and they also got beat by Roberto Clemente in 71.
Right.
Well,
71, the Giants, I was out in California. My old New York Giants became the San Francisco Giants, and they gave the Pirates quite a run in the playoffs that year.
Yep.
So things could have been a lot different. It could have been the orange and black versus the orange and black.
Orange and black, that's right. And, and then Harry went on to worked for Gene Autry for a number of years. And helped sort of build the Angels. Didn't have much success on the field, but he helped build the Angels into a winner. And then he went to work in Milwaukee, where he turned Milwaukee into a winner. They made their first two playoff appearances, made their only World Series appearance in 1982, and then they also were highly competitive throughout the mid-'80s into the early '90s. Largely in part because of the work that Harry and his baseball people had done, because Milwaukee was already starting to feel the financial pinch. Well, unfortunately, Harry died so early. He died in 2005 that he's largely forgotten, which is sort of a shame, because these days we know the general managers, we know the team builders of teams almost as good as we know the players, right?
Yeah,
and
we do, and part of it is if he had been associated with New York teams, he'd have gotten so much more press. If he had that success with the Yankees or the Mets, he would have.
If he had been George, you're right. If he had been George Weiss, he'd be in the Hall of Fame. Absolutely.
Exactly.
Exactly. And that's my larger point is eventually, when you take into account the fact that, Bud Selig told me in an interview that he gave me for the book, and I was thrilled to be able to get it. I've interviewed Brooks Robinson and Nolan Ryan and Bud Selig, and the list goes on and on and on. Andy Etchebarren before he passed away, Don Buford, some real stalwarts of Harry's career. Pete Vukovich was kind enough to give me an interview. One of the things Bud said is that any time that they had a problem in Major League Baseball that they wanted to look at, whether it was shortening the schedule or the collective bargaining agreement, they looked to Harry first, because he was the great deep thinker of baseball.
Right.
He was on the.
He wasn't like. I'm trying to think of somebody who really tooted his own horn, and I can't at the moment.
He was not. To give you an idea, an example of. Yep. He was not. to give you an example from Harry's own career, he was not Buzzy Bavasi.
That would be a perfect example. That was that was the guy, the prototype for look at me, then look at the team, and then look at me again. That's basically Buzzy Bavasi, who wanted his name on the top of every story, where Harry would talk about his manager, his players, his coaches, he just didn't have that flair, and I say that as a compliment. He was just a modest man, and
everyone that worked for him has said the exact same thing. He was a type of guy. Nolan Ryan gave me a great example. When Harry traded for Nolan Ryan, they got along very well. And Nolan credits Harry for allowing him to become the Nolan Ryan that we know, right? His managers and Harry, they let him run out there every 4 days and throw. And, if he was wild, okay, fine, but you're going to throw every 4 days. He goes, when Harry would come into the clubhouse, Nolan said that Harry was the only guy he ever saw where guys didn't tense up like like the principal was in the room. He goes, guys would just be themselves, and they'd talk to Harry, and Harry would ask them about anything, how's your family, how's, this and that, and joke and laugh with them when it was appropriate. And he built a very good rapport.
What made up his character? Who passed on the good traits? Was it his dad or?
I think what made his character, Ralph, was a couple of things. On a personal level, like you said, he was very humble. And it wasn't a false humble. He was genuinely humbled to be where he was. The other thing that was cognizant was he was willing to listen to everyone. If they were considering making a trade, even if he had an opinion that he knew he was going to go with, he listened to everyone. He made everyone feel like they were part of the decision. And I think that went a long way with building loyalty for people. Mm-hmm. The other thing that he allowed was because he was almost egoless in a way. He knew he was good at his job, but he didn't have to tell people that he was good at his job. So what happened was, as you said, he would always talk about his manager or his players. So they talk about in Baltimore the Oriole way. What is the Oriole way? And it was the way that they were taught and the way they were managed. And everybody has claimed that, well, Earl was the father of the Oriole way, or Paul Richards, who had predated Earl as the manager and GM, was the father. Yep, the Baby Birds. Well, what really, when you look at it, especially in the 60s, once Harry took over, Harry's role in the Oriole way was allowing other people to think they were more important than he was. So, for instance, if Earl wanted the Baltimore Sun-Times to think that he was where the buck stopped, and Earl wanted to get his name in the paper, and Earl could go out and yell and scream at umpires, and they wanted to cover that, Harry let them. Because it made Earl feel like how he needed to feel. And all the while, Harry knew that...
No, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead. I said,
I was just going to ask if there were any controversies in his life that stand out. No, that's the really amazing thing about it. Is, well, not amazing now that I know the individual, but the thing that I found the most interesting was that he
he was not the type of person that was good at his job, but a bad human being. Okay, he wasn't a degenerate gambler. He wasn't a serial he wasn't a serial cheater or any of these things that you'd find out later about people. He didn't necessarily live clean, but the way he lived was treat people well, and I'll treat, as long as you treat me well. Every person that I've worked with said, or that I've talked to has said, Harry was a great person to work for because what came out of Harry's mouth was what he actually felt.
Lee, what did you learn in researching the book that surprised you?
I think what really surprised me was I originally came at this, and you were talking about the Milwaukee Braves, and I cut my teeth as a baseball fan on Harry's teams of the late 80s. And what I found surprising, again, not once I dove into it, was that here was a man that wasn't getting the credit he deserved, even though he continued to evolve, right? So he started out with teams under the reserve clause. Then the first teams he built in California were under free agency. And then he went to Milwaukee into a cash-strapped situation, and he kept them relevant for almost 20 years. And as growing up, you'd think, well, maybe I'm misremembering this. Maybe they weren't as good as they were, right? I think they were. The teams of sainted memory. And the thing that surprised me is when you look at it, his later teams in Milwaukee were very good. And if they had played under a different structure, they would have, if they had played under today's structure, they would have made the playoffs a bunch. But,
do you think
in the American...
really held them back or advanced them?
I think that Bud's biggest problem vis-a-vis that team was that after a while, and they had started knowing, Harry had known they had had financial troubles all the way back in the 83-84 seasons. They were starting to have the financial troubles that were going to make them really hurt in the 90s. And I think what held Harry back from a baseball standpoint is although he developed great talent, they had the best minor league organization in baseball 3 years running, 85, 86, 87, according to Baseball America. What held them back was the fact that Bud did not have the financial wherewithal to be able to say, okay, Harry, you've now got a competitive team. Go out and get the guy that's going to put you over the top. A perfect example of this is after Harry was actually let go as the general manager, the next year with a team that he largely built, Sal Bando was the GM of a team that finished second in the American League East behind Toronto. And near the deadline, the Brewers were in the running to get David Cohn and couldn't afford it. And that happened to Harry a bunch. Is
David
because
Cohn was as solid as you could get with the Yankees.
Yeah, right.
He would have been.
And that would have made the difference.
It certainly would have.
He goes to Toronto, and Toronto wins the pennant. He goes to Milwaukee. Milwaukee probably wins the pennant that year, or wins the division. So I think that's the thing. There were so many teams in the mid and late 80s where if they would have had one more piece, they would have been a playoff team, probably.
Yeah, I followed that team very closely. I was the Tops rep on the West Coast, and
Okay.
Stockton was their their affiliate.
They're Class A in the California League. Yep.
Right, and I got to see them every year and develop some terrific friendships with, as an example, Mark Tell, who's joined my network and is a podcaster on Comfortably Zoned Network. He was the pitching coach, and there were some terrific coaches. Gary Sheffield came through there. It was just a pleasure to see a solid organization. They always brought back their great players as coaches. Larry Heisel, a number of them, and it's just a good, warm feeling about the Milwaukee Brewers, if for no other reason than they got screwed when the Braves left. The city did.
Yeah.
And it was nice to see them get a team back.
Well, there's a lot of similarities between, you bring up the Braves, and people here, believe it or not, people in Wisconsin love to talk Milwaukee Braves baseball. They will talk Milwaukee Braves baseball. I know that you and I were talking about Pat Jordan's time in the minor leagues with Milwaukee. He wrote a fall spring.
At Eau Claire, he was Pat Jordan was Hank Aaron's teammate at Eau Claire in like 1953 or 52.
Yeah, it was Pat was there a little later than that, but the vibe was still there, and it was it's amazing to see the similarities actually between some of Harry's better teams and those Brave teams. They had two things. They had great pitching. Obviously, the 71 Orioles, they had four starters that won 20 games or more. But the pitching, even in Milwaukee in the late 80s, they had solid pitching. They had guys that could flat out hit. Professional hitters that could hit for power and average. And then, they those
guys.
Yep. Milwaukee had Paul Molitor and Robin Yount, and obviously when you put a lineup together that includes in Baltimore, when you put Frank Robinson and Brooks Robinson and Boog Powell in a lineup in the middle of the order, much like you could put Joe Adcock and Hank Aaron and Eddie Matthews, you really start to go, wow, they're going to win a lot of games.
Good shortstops too, Logan and
yep.
With
Mark Belanger in Baltimore.
With Baltimore, yes.
Yep.
And a team needs to be strong up the middle, and those teams had that in common, including depth. A team that what they had in common was that depth where if there was an injury, you could fill in and guys can play. I'll give you a name for, you said you really enjoyed the 57 Braves, 58 Braves. I'll give you a name that, people here just still, if you hit the right person, Hurricane Hazel. A guy who he was, as you're a Giant fan, okay, so he was the Braves' Dusty Rhodes. Yes.
Bob Hazel was the Braves' Dusty Rhodes, and so he was
something that year. I think he hit like 403, limited amount that he didn't qualify for the batting cut.
In Baltimore, Harry always had a guy like that. He had a Merv Retmond. He had in Milwaukee in his
Lowenstein, guys like that were just pure hitters.
Guys that could do. It was in Milwaukee. He had the Ernest Riles.
Yes. Later
Ernie Riles, who played for the Giants. Those types of guys, right? And And I think that's the thing is when you look at Harry's career, he could and did win in every era of baseball for 40 years. And then when you look at it, he was the model for the GM that we have today, which is team building's your number one job. And all these people, we're going to ask the baseball ops people, what's the best way? Harry was even starting to work with analytics that as we know them now, in the late 80s. And, sabermetrics and things that are normal now that were above and beyond anything anyone had ever seen. So,
Lee, he died very early. What precipitated his death?
He developed Parkinson's, which was a very sad thing to have to write about. But even in that case, I got great help from his family, who's been nothing but informative for me, and also a gentleman who kind of was his, not his caretaker, but was just kind of a buddy that he would go places with, and get Harry out of the house. In his retirement, he loved going to the Dairy Queen. Like he was just a normal guy.
Yeah.
I like saying that he never got enamored with being Harry Dalton. He never sat there and was.
There's that Midwest living that isn't like it is on the coast. There's
well, and Harry's a small Western Massachusetts kid. He grew up in Springfield, and that's a blue-collar area. Still is.
I know my cousins lived in Holyoke, which was right across
the neighboring town over. Yep. And so it's. I think the thing that though was when Harry died in 2005, he died of Parkinson's, and what really hurt him from a baseball standpoint was that the people that he worked with started to write books and talk about their time, right? And so another man that you're familiar with, two people that others are familiar with that helped sort of reshape Harry's story to the detriment of Harry in some ways. One was Frank Cashin, who was actually, technically on paper, he was Harry's boss in Baltimore. He was a conduit between Jerry Hoffberger and the baseball operations people. And Frank came in and basically in his memoirs wrote that, contrary to belief, Harry wasn't the GM and he had to get things cleared through me. But when you look at the period stuff, especially when you look at Hoffberger's own words, it was more a matter of Frank's understanding of it was more of a matter of semantics. And he had much less to do with the baseball operations than he's made out to be. I had a source tell me a story in the 1970s when the Orioles were going good, 70, 71, 69. Someone who worked for the Colts, because the Baltimore Colts to the NFL shared Memorial Stadium with the Orioles, and they said you would see Harry and his guys, right, at Oriole games or in the offices and stuff. And he goes, the thing that always impressed him with Frank Cashin was that Frank could carry a bottle of National Bohemia, which was the brewery owned by Jerry Hoffberger, who owned the Orioles, in such a way as that the label would always be facing out towards whoever Frank was walking towards. And that was the takeaway that this gentleman came away with. And he goes, Harry impressed me over and above. He goes, you'd see Harry out, and those guys worked. And they showed you what professionalism was. And that carried through Harry's whole career. So I think the thing that's hurt Harry is he was very humble. He didn't want to write his own book. And then somebody else started to write books about that time, and they cut Harry out. So
he didn't have a flag waiver. He didn't have one particular guy to bring him into the hall, so to speak.
Yeah, and I'm leery of books that are used simply as a platform to get someone into the Hall of Fame. But my hope is that in writing his story and his impact on baseball, people really start to look at the fact that he was that important. And Ralph, I'll throw this out to you and your listeners. You consider that both Pat Gillick, to a lesser extent, and John Schuerholz learned their baseball from Harry Dalton. And they're both in the Hall of Fame. And in some ways, Harry had a much better career than John Schuerholz did, even though Schuerholz would win many more pennants. If you want to talk simple winning, Harry won more World Series. When you look at it that way, this is a man that shaped careers of people that have worked in baseball for lifetimes. He was Dan Duquette's boss in Milwaukee. He was Lou Gorman was his assistant in Baltimore as the assistant farm director, and he went on to manage, was the general manager of the Boston Red Sox. All of these guys. Go ahead.
This is one deserving man.
Yeah. When you break it all down, this is a guy who
decade by decade, he should be in there.
Yeah.
No question.
That's my argument. It's even if you, and the team building is one thing. We fixate on wins, right?
Right.
I mean, the game's about winning. You fixate on titles and things like that. But when you really look at it, I mean,
Whoop, am I losing you?
No, I'm sorry.
Okay.
The early CBA work existed because Harry did a lot of the legwork. And actually, it's funny. Marvin Miller, who's going into the Hall of Fame, and rightfully so.
God, we thought that would never happen.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. You would think that Harry would have had an adversarial role with Marvin Miller, and they didn't. They actually had a very good relationship as far as the fact that they respected each other, because each was a learned person in their own respects. People have told me that it negotiated with Harry, that the one great thing about negotiating with Harry is you never felt that he was going to try to tell you that you were worse than you were. He wouldn't give it away, meaning money. He wouldn't give it away, but he wouldn't necessarily walk into a room and go, well, you didn't earn it. If you won 20 games, Harry would pay you. He would also, the famous story is that he looked at Brooks Robinson, and he and Brooks Robinson argued over $50. They'd come down to the last $50, or five. I think it was $50, and he looked at him and said, "Okay, you want it? I'll give it to you. But next year, you remember I gave it to you." And they went on their way. So Harry was the kind of guy that sort of expected loyalty if he had given someone loyalty to begin with. But not in a bad way.
Much about Frank Robinson at all?
In the sense that he was a good. The two things I learned about Frank's time with Baltimore were this. I learned three things about Frank vis-a-vis Harry. The first was that Harry never claimed to have made the trade. The trade was already done. Harry just signed off on it. And Harry said that himself. He goes, I get credit for it, but he goes, it was done. Now, Harry still put the team together in such a way that they ended up winning. The other thing is that Frank, as you well know, and many of your listeners most likely know, Frank could be very combative if he felt someone was cheapening his efforts, especially if that cheapening came at the race, was done using a race angle. And what I learned from Frank, reading about Frank's time with Baltimore and asking other people, Don Buford was one, if Harry ever had any problems as far as communicating with players of different races, Don Buford told me, he goes, no, in fact, he goes, Frank got along great with Harry and never felt like Harry was trying to cheapen his contributions and using race to do it. Or there's a famous photo of Don Buford throwing Harry in a whirlpool tub after they had clinched the pennant in, I believe, 1969. And I asked Don about the picture, and he goes, yeah, Marcelino Lopez and I threw Harry in the tub. And he goes, and it was great because normally we wouldn't do something like that, but Harry was just one of the guys. He didn't see color. He didn't see socioeconomic status. He just wanted to win, just like we did.
What a
there was a funny. There was
a baseball man as a human being.
Yeah, exactly. There's a famous story. I just think it's great. You asked about Frank. Everyone has seen the picture of Frank Robinson holding kangaroo court in the Baltimore locker room with the mop on his head, right?
Yes.
And sort of being the judge and jury in the kangaroo court. And he goes, one day they had won a game and they're sitting around and they're having a couple beers and they're doing the kangaroo court, and Harry walked into the clubhouse, and people sort of tensed up a little bit, not much, but you could tell, hey, the boss is in here. And he goes, Frank looks up at him and looks down at Harry's feet and goes, Dalton, that'll be a $20 fine. We shine our shoes in this club. And the whole room got silent because they wanted to see how Harry was going to react. And Harry digs into his suit. He takes his wallet out, puts $20 on the table, and puts his wallet away. And it broke up the whole room.
Oh,
Harry was the kind of guy that just wanted to be one of the guys. Knew he was management, but wanted to be one of the guys. That's why I think you asked me about controversies, and I don't think it was so much a controversy, an actual controversy. Later in his career, he was accused by Gary Sheffield of being racist. Mainly because the Brewers were really high on Billy Spires, a white player at shortstop, and that facilitated a move of Gary Sheffield to third base to sort of be the heir apparent to Paul Molitor. And Gary camped the move in the mechanics of race and really blamed Harry for being the catalyst. And there's, the unfortunate thing is that there was really no evidence to support that those things happened. In fact, Harry did certain things over and above what he would have normally done for other ball players to sort of make a young Gary Sheffield feel like he was comfortable in his life with the ball club. He brought in mentors for Sheffield. against his better judgment, Harry, at the behest of others, was asked to bring in Gary's family on the road so that they would be available to him. And then
part of Gary's family was Doc Gooden.
Yep, exactly. And Gary learned from Doc, and Doc's own admission, Gary learned from Doc that you didn't, it was the transition of the period. You didn't take what the ball club was giving you at face value. And because in their minds,
I got to meet Gary Sheffield in the minors, and way before any of this. And I saw the essence of the man. I communicated with him, and I saw his respect for the game, or lack of respect for the game. His respect for himself, or lack of respect for himself. His respect for the people around him, his teammates, his coaches, his manager. It just wasn't there. Gary came
It wasn't a matter of whether, and I think that's the thing. Harry stuck with it for a long time, right?
He was fighting a losing battle. This kid was what he was when he was 20 years old, and
what was a big problem, what spelled the death knell for Harry in Milwaukee was that regardless of what Bud Selig may have done in the commissioner's office, good or bad, at a certain point later in Harry's career, Bud started to interfere in the day-to-day baseball operations more than he had previously. And he had camped it in the fact that the money had started to go up and therefore he needed to be more involved. And what happened was that he would, at times, countermand baseball decisions. And he felt that Gary was, for lack of a better word, savable. That the talent outweighed all the problems.
He wasn't, and you know what? Bud Selig was like the example of the Peter principle. He was a used car salesman. For him to have gotten involved in anything to do with the baseball aspect of the game was counterproductive. And how he ever became commissioner is absolutely beyond me.
Well, he did that largely in some ways because he set up the system to allow him to become the gatekeeper, right? And he's since redrawn his own history. But again, my job with writing about Harry is to highlight Harry. It's not to knock Bud or anybody else.
Of course, and this is just conversation. As I say.
But I think the thing is, I'll give you another prime example. So in the Sheffield case, Harry wanted to cut bait on Gary long before they actually did. And he didn't. And therefore the market went down. They didn't get nearly enough back from San Diego. And it really put Milwaukee in a hole. The other situation that I use is and a name I'm sure you're familiar with is Teddy Higuera. Teddy was a outstanding pitcher in the mid-1980s. He had finished second in the Cy Young in '86 to Roger Clemens. He's one of 3 20-game winners in the history of the Brewers, and probably will be their last 20-game winner, unless the mechanics of pitching changes. And he had become a free agent, and Harry had gotten good medical advice from their doctors saying, Teddy Higuera's shoulder is going to explode. Don't offer him anything more than a 1-year deal if you're going to offer him a contract at all. At that point, they had decided that they were going to let him walk. They would somehow pitch patch their pitching rotation together, that they were going to let him walk, and they would be all right. Bud Selig decided that that was not the way to go, as was his right, I guess you could call it, as the owner. They signed Higuera to a long-term deal. At the winter meetings when they did that, the beat reporter for the Milwaukee Brewers at the time saw Harry in the lobby and said, "Well, Harry, you must be thrilled." And Harry goes, "I don't know whether to laugh or cry." Shortly thereafter, signing Higuera to that long-term deal, his shoulder did explode. And he was never the same pitcher, and he never really contributed to Milwaukee at all in the second half of his career. And it just highlights to me the fact that Harry and the baseball people, especially at that time, knew what they were doing and didn't succeed sometimes because they weren't left to do their jobs. And Harry never complained about Bud. In fact, when Bud let him go at the end of the 91 season, he was made a figurehead vice president, meaning Harry, where he did some feasibility studies for Bud, but largely he was relegated to a back office with a junior PR man. And he was kept as far away from the baseball operations as possible, and was really treated quite shabbily by Bud and some of the other people in the office, to be completely honest. Especially for two people that had such a close relationship. And when Harry was finally let go, and people would ask him about that, Harry would go, he's the owner. He can do what he wants. He's paid me a lot of money, and I'm not going to complain about it.
Did anybody in his family tell you what Harry really felt about any of this?
That was how he felt. That was literally how he felt. And that's been told to me by every member of his family. In fact, in some levels, other people were and are more upset about the end of his career than he was. But to give you an idea about the end of his career, what people don't realize is in about 91, the Cubs hired, I want to say it was Andy MacPhail, to run their baseball operations. Their original choice for that job was Harry Dalton. And Harry chose to retire instead of going to work. But they wanted him to come to Chicago and run the Cubs. But he had built a house in Arizona with his wife, and he had 3 kids that were in college, and he wanted to experience life outside of baseball, because here's the other thing, he was a really learned guy. He liked doing other things. I mean, in the midst of the 1968 season, one of the most poignant interviews I ever read during that whole time in Baltimore was up and down in the standings, and he gave a talk about to Milt Richmond of the Associated Press about his feelings regarding Bobby Kennedy's assassination. And the earlier assassination of Martin Luther King, and he wondered what kind of environment his kids were going to grow up into. So this was a guy that saw a bigger world than what he was doing. And as it turned out, it was a good thing that he had retired. His family is thrilled that he got a chance to retire and enjoy himself, because his Parkinson's, crept up on him and really became a detriment to his quality of living at one point.
Lee, just that you noticed those traits in Harry Dalton means that you're somewhat aware yourself of the world we live in and what's going on. This is transcendental to all of what we've talked about, but here we are. with a country that is in the process of losing democracy. Do you have a few words, personal words, to say about what's going on in the world we live in?
Ralph, it's not that I don't have my own opinions, but much like Harry, and I've spent so much time walking around in Harry's own mind, right? Mm-hmm. He ultimately understood that his job was to do as best a job as he could, and the rest would sort itself out. And in this case, my job is to show people that Harry Dalton was a great person. He was a great father. He was a great baseball man. But that right now is my job, and one that I'm pleased to have. And all I can say is that, like Harry, I see great things in the game of baseball and their recuperative powers. So even though the game right now is going through a sort of bad stretch, thanks to some of the bad PR they've been receiving about cheating scandals and everything else, the game has these sorts of recuperative powers that they will bring people to a better place that they can then apply, hopefully, to their own lives. And that's my hope for America, is that people take those things in their lives that have those recuperative powers and use them as a catalyst to see the betterment of themselves and other people. Because that's what Harry would have done.
Lee, let me ask you, is baseball a microcosm of life, or is life a microcosm of baseball?
Yeah. I think in some ways baseball is a microcosm of life. There's labor dispute, and there's funny things, and there's tragic things, and there's the day-to-day grind of just doing the same thing every day. It's 162 days of life encapsulated in 162 nine-inning versions.
Wow.
And yet it has this ability that regardless of the problems, it can make people happy and it can show people a better way. If you look at the way that the country had divided itself in 1968, by 1970, and baseball was a prime example of that. William Eckert, who was the commissioner at the time, didn't know if MLB should carry on during the assassination period of Martin Luther King, how it was going to handle the assassination of Bobby Kennedy. And yet, by 1971, we had come so far in the game of baseball that Danny Murtaugh didn't see any problem in penciling in 9 players of color in his starting lineup and saying, you know what, we're in a different America. I can do that, and I'm not worried about it. So that's how baseball can help you rebound.
I just flashed on the 1951 World Series when, because Don Mueller broke his ankle, Monty Irvin, Willie Mays, and Hank Thompson were the first all-black outfield in the history of baseball. That was 1951. Wow. Baseball transcends a lot of things.
Yep, you think about it. I mean, that Pirate team in 71, they routinely started, Al Oliver and Roberto Clemente and Manny Sanguin, and the list goes on. And when Doc Ellis was pitching, they had 9 people of color on the field at one time. Even 3 years earlier, that would have seemed inconceivable. And yet we had come that far as a country that you could look at that and go, you know what, that's normal.
In 1958,
I mean, the Baltimore teams in
Boston hadn't even had one black player in 1958. So a lot of it is.
And you wonder why the National League. I mean, part of it too is the National League was better, right? People have proven this out. The National League was better because they integrated quicker.
Absolutely.
You had teams like New York and Milwaukee and Brooklyn, and you know, that said, hey, this is untapped talent. We don't care.
Right.
They could be orange.
The only
they can hit
League team
field.
to do that was the Cleveland Indians.
Bill Veeck. And Bill was another one that he didn't care. He just, you know, it's funny. In Bill's mind, right, all money is green.
Right.
And he didn't care where it came from or who helped him get it.
The likes of Larry Doby and Satchel Paige and what have you.
Yep.
Lee, we could go on
Baltimore.
forever. You are a terrific guest. Time got us.
Well, I appreciate it.
Please promise to come back and let us know how the book is coming in terms of marketing it. And I'll ask you one more question. What's your next project?
Oh, so my next project, that's a good question. I've started to kind of look.
Isn't bad?
Huh?
1 out of 17 good questions are good.
Yeah. That is a good. Well, you're a cerebral kind of guy. You know, Ralph. You ask good questions. I will say this. It will be. I'm either looking at continuing my work on baseball in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, because I feel that that's kind of an underrepresented time in the historiography of the game of baseball.
Right.
Or the other thing I will do is kind of stay in sports history but go away from baseball. And I always felt that an event that was not covered to the extent that it should be because of its impact on the sport that it is involved was the 1964 U.S. Open golf tournament that was held in Washington, D.C., where the winner, Ken Venturi, almost died due to heat stroke because they played 36 holes in one day. You know, they played 18 holes on Friday, 18 holes on Thursday, 18 holes on Friday, and 36 holes marathon on Saturday. Well, they played it in over 100-degree heat indexes. And it was sort of this watershed event for golf, especially as it creeped into the middle and late 60s. So it's kind of what I'm toying around with. But if I come back to baseball again, it'll be what's really great now is that you're starting to get the ability to really study the period of baseball that I grew up in and around. And there are a lot of great stories that I'm hoping to tell. So, and I will most certainly, Ralph, you're my guy. I'll come back anytime you want.
That's a compliment, my friend. I appreciate that very much.
And I appreciate you having me on today.
All right. It's the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. I am Ralph Tycho, the weak link of the entire thing. But I'm good at getting guests who are interesting. Told you. Thanks again for listening, everybody. And thank you, Lee Kluck. You're terrific.
Thank you.
All right. Be well. We'll be back at you.
Yep, be well, Ralph.
Before you know it. Thanks
yep,
again.
Sounds good. Thank you, sir.
Bye.
Bye.
The proceeding has been a Comfortably Zoned network production. You are advised to keep your dreams wet, your humor dry, your children and grandchildren out of military recruiting offices and off the laps of clerics who wear dresses. Thank you for listening, everyone. Happy trails.